The Silence Between Us, a dramatic narrative script, narrated in the first person by Alara Voss. Part 1. The Woman Who Watches. My name is Alara Voss, and I have always known how to disappear inside a room full of people. I am 31 years old. I have dark brown hair that I keep pinned at the back of my neck, not because it suits me, but because it keeps people from noticing me. I wear grey most days. Not a fashionable charcoal, not a bold slate, but the quiet grey of pigeons on the Rhine Bridge at dawn. The colour of something no one thinks to look at twice. I have lived in Cologne my entire adult life, in a third-floor apartment with windows that face north, which means the light is always flat and honest and never flatters anything. I think that is why I chose it. I work as a data archivist for a mid-size insurance company called Bernhardt und Wolf. My job is to organize information that other people have already gathered and considered unimportant enough to hand off to someone like me. I am very good at my job. I am good at it because I understand that everything that has ever happened leaves a trace, and the person who understands traces is the person who understands everything. I was not always the person who watches, or perhaps I was and I simply did not have a name for it yet. The first time I understood that I perceived the world differently from other people, I was 9 years old. My father had taken me to the livestock market in the village of Monschau, a small town in the Eifel Hills, about an hour south of Cologne, where my grandparents lived. It was October. The air smelled of cold straw and animal warmth, and the wood smoke that poured from the chimneys of the old half-timbered houses. I remember the colours of everything. The deep rust of the market stalls, the pale, exhausted faces of the farmers, the brown flanks of the cattle slick with morning rain. A farmer was leading a calf through a narrow pen. The calf was young, its legs still uncertain, beneath it, and it was making a sound that I did not recognize at first, a low and constant sound, almost like breathing, made audible. The farmer gripped the rope with both hands and pulled the calf toward the far end of the pen, where a door opened into a building I had not noticed before. The door closed, the sound stopped. My father bought cheese and bread and said something to the vendor about the weather. A woman next to us laughed about something her husband had done. Children ran between the stalls. I stood still and looked at the door. I was not frightened. I was not sad. I was watching the logic of it. The sequence, the rope, the pen, the door, the silence. How one thing led to another with a completeness that felt to me like the solution to a long equation. Everything that had a beginning had an end. And the person holding the rope was simply the person who understood that the end was coming and had decided to be the one to bring it. My father touched my shoulder and asked me if I was cold. I said no and followed him to the car. That night I lay in my grandparents' guest room and thought about the calf. Not with grief. I want to be clear about that. With interest. With the precise, focused attention of someone who has just been shown a mechanism they had not previously known existed. I thought about ropes and pens and doors. I thought about the farmer's hands. I thought about what it meant to hold the rope. I did not tell anyone about these thoughts. Even at 9, I understood that thoughts like these belonged only to me. The interior of a mind is the only space no one can enter without permission, and I have always been very careful about who I permit. That is how I grew up, quiet, watchful, present, in every room, but visible in none of them. My teachers called me diligent and undemanding. My classmates, if asked to describe me, would have paused and said something vague. My mother loved me in the way that people love things they do not fully understand, which is to say she loved me loudly and often, and with a kind of desperate cheerfulness that exhausted us both. My father loved me more quietly and more accurately, and it was from him that I learned to trust silence. I had no plan in those years. I was simply accumulating. Information patterns the invisible architecture of other people's habits and weaknesses and needs. I did not know yet what I would do with any of it. I only knew that I was building something. And then my sister got married, and the thing I had been building became something I never expected it to be. Part 2, the husband. His name was Felix Marchetti, half Italian, half German, born in Munich, educated at the Freie Universität in Berlin, currently a senior partner at the architectural firm Gruner und Marchetti in Cologne. 40 years old, dark hair turning silver at the temples. The kind of man who wore expensive shoes and remembered the names of waiters. He had a particular way of listening to people, a slight forward lean, an expression of focused attention, that made whoever he was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. I recognized it immediately as a technique. My sister Maren had met him at a gallery opening in the Ehrenfeld district of Cologne 4 years before the story I am about to tell you. She was 27. He was 36. She had been drinking a glass of white wine and looking at a painting she did not understand when he came to stand beside her and said something quietly perceptive about the painting that made her feel, I think, as though she had been suddenly promoted. Maren has always responded to intelligence. It is her great vulnerability. She mistakes the appearance of depth for depth itself. And Felix Marchetti was very good at the appearance of depth. They were engaged within 8 months, married within the year. I was her maid of honor. I wore a pale blue dress that did not suit me, stood beside her at the altar of the Gross Sankt Martin Church in the Old City, and watched Felix Marchetti look at my sister with an expression of perfect, practiced adoration that I understood even then was not quite real. I said nothing. It was not my place to say anything, and perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I was projecting something dark onto a man who was simply in love with my sister, in the ordinary, imperfect way that human beings love one another. I went home after the reception and sat in my north-facing apartment and thought about Felix Marchetti for a long time. I was not jealous. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Maren and I are sisters, and I love her in a way that is not easy to articulate because it is not gentle. It is not the soft, decorative love that people put on greeting cards. It is the kind of love that is almost violent in its completeness. The kind of love that looks at the person and thinks, I would do anything. I would rearrange the world for you. I would make things disappear. That is what I felt for Maren, and I felt it without sentiment, the way you feel the weight of your own body when you stand still. I watched Felix Marchetti for the next 3 years, not obsessively, not in a way that anyone would notice. I did it the same way I do everything systematically, at a distance with patience. When I attended family dinners at their apartment in Lindenthal, I noticed things, small things. The way Felix checked his phone during the meal and then placed it face down on the table. The particular quality of his attention when Maren was speaking, which was present but slightly elevated, the way a person pays attention when they are also thinking about something else. The faint, almost imperceptible tension in his jaw when Maren mentioned the name of a colleague named Sophie. Sophie Bauer, 33 years old, fellow architect at Gruner und Marchetti, sharp attractive in an angular, confident way. I had seen her at the firm's Christmas party 2 years earlier, standing near Felix with a glass of red wine, speaking about a project in a low voice that was positioned, I noted, slightly too close to be purely professional. I said nothing. I filed the information. I continued watching. In the spring of the 3rd year of Maren and Felix's marriage, my sister called me at 11 o'clock at night. She was crying in the way that people cry when they have been trying not to cry for a very long time and have finally run out of the strength to stop. I listened to her for 40 minutes. She suspected something was wrong, but did not know what. Felix had become distant, not cruel, not obviously disengaged, but there was a quality to his presence in their home that was like a photograph slightly out of focus, almost right. Not quite right. Not. I told her she was probably tired from work. I told her these things went in cycles. I told her to get some sleep and that I would come over on Saturday. After I hung up, I sat with my hands flat on the table for a long time looking at nothing. Then I began. Part 3, the archive. I have a particular skill that is not on my resume. Over the years, through careful attention and a certain talent for making myself invisible, in plain sight, I have learned how to move through people's lives without leaving tracks. I do not do anything illegal. I have never needed to. People who have something to hide are almost always less careful than they believe themselves to be. Because the act of hiding things requires energy, and over time, exhaustion causes erosion, and erosion causes visibility, and visibility is all I need. Felix Marchetti was tired. He was careful with his phone. He was careful with his schedule. He was careful with his expressions in social settings with Marin present. But he was not careful in the way that a truly disciplined person is careful at the level of habit, at the level of the body. He was careful in the way a person is careful when they are managing a situation, which is to say consciously, effortfully, and therefore not always. I started with public information. His firm's website listed current projects. His Instagram, rarely updated, but publicly viewable, contained photographs of buildings travel, the occasional dinner. Sophie Bauer's Instagram, also public, contained similar things. Professionally speaking, there was nothing unusual. But I am an archivist. I understand that what is not there is sometimes more informative than what is. In the 12 months before I began watching closely, Felix had posted 3 photographs from his firm's work trips. One to Vienna, one to Zurich, one to Copenhagen. In each photograph, multiple colleagues appeared. Sophie Bauer appeared in none of them, which is precisely the kind of not there that tells a story. She was on those trips. Her absence from his photographs was a deliberate choice, which means he was managing an image, which means there was something to manage. I found her in the background of a colleague's tagged photograph from the Vienna trip, standing at a restaurant table. Felix was at the same table at the far end. They were not touching. They were not looking at each other. But the distance between them had the specific quality of distance that people create when they are trying to appear unaware of each other, which is always slightly overdone. Slightly too spacious, the way people behave around a secret. I noted this. Over the following months, I gathered more. Not evidence in any legal sense, impressions, patterns, the small behavioral typography of a man conducting an affair. The way Felix began working late on Tuesdays, specifically. The way he had, about 6 months earlier, switched from keeping his phone charged on the bedside table during weekends at home, as Marin had mentioned, to keeping it in his jacket pocket at all times. The way he had developed a new interest in cycling, which conveniently required him to leave early on Saturday mornings with his phone, but without his wife. None of this was proof of anything. All of it was the map of something. I am a patient person. I did not act. I continued to gather and to organize the way I do with the data at Bernhardt und Wolff, fitting pieces together, without forcing them, waiting for the structure to declare itself. It declared itself on an ordinary Wednesday in November. So, Part 4, the Wednesday. I do not believe in coincidence as a category. What people call coincidence is usually the point at which 2 patterns that have been running in parallel long enough finally intersect. The intersection feels surprising because people do not usually watch both patterns at once. I do. On that Wednesday in November, I left work at 6 o'clock. It was already dark. The Rhine was low and metallic under the street lamps, and the air smelled of rain and diesel. I was walking to the tram stop, taking the route along the Rheinufer that I take every Wednesday, because it is 7 minutes faster than the alternative when I saw them. Felix and Sophie, coming out of a side entrance of a hotel on the Konrad Adenauer Ufer, not touching, not even walking close together, But there again was that specific quality of distance, the managed distance of two people who know they should not be seen together, who are practicing the art of appearing to be strangers. Sophie turned right. Felix turned left. Felix walked approximately 15 meters before he took out his phone and I saw his shoulders change. The specific release of a particular tension, the exhale of someone who has passed through a risky doorway. I stood on the pavement and watched him walk away until he was absorbed by the crowd at the tram stop. Then I turned and walked home. I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about this. I did not feel the hot, immediate indignation that I imagine other people might have felt. What I felt was closer to the coldness that comes when something you have suspected for a long time is finally confirmed. The coldness of a hypothesis proven, of a pattern complete. I sat in my apartment for 3 hours. I made tea and let it go cold. I looked at the wall for a long time, and then I thought about Maren. Not about Felix, not about Sophie, not about what I had seen. I thought about my sister, 29 years old, calling me at 11 o'clock at night, with that sound in her voice. The specific sound of someone who knows something is wrong, but has not yet been given permission to know it. I made a decision, but the decision I made was not the one you might expect. Part 5, the choice I did not make. I want to tell you what I could have done. I want to tell you because I think it matters to understand the options available to a person who watches the way I watch, who gathers the way I gather. I could have confronted Felix, shown up at his office, or at a moment of my choosing, laid the information before him with the particular calm that comes from absolute preparation, and watched him understand that I knew everything and that his choices from that moment forward would be made with that knowledge in mind. I could have gone to Maren immediately, told her everything I had observed, every thread. I had pulled the Vienna photograph, the Tuesday evenings, the hotel on the Konrad Adenauer Ufer, made the decision for her, forced the crisis into the open, and let the consequences fall where they would. I could have gone to Sophie Bauer. This option interested me, not because I am cruel, but because Sophie occupied a particular position in the architecture of this situation. She knew she was the third party. She had made choices. She was in the specific geometry of this situation, the load-bearing element that would be most affected by any adjustment to the structure. I considered all of these options with the same careful attention I give to everything. I laid them out in my mind like documents on a table and examined them from every angle. What each would cause, who each would harm, what each would prevent. And then I put them all away, because I am my father's daughter. And my father understood something that took me a long time to fully absorb. He understood that the most powerful thing you can do with information is not always to use it. Sometimes the most powerful thing is to decide with full knowledge of what you know, what you are willing to let exist, and why. I thought about Maren. I thought about what she needed, which was not information, or not yet. What she needed was to trust her own perception. She already knew something was wrong. She had known it for months. She had called me at 11 at night, with that knowing in her voice. What she lacked was not data. What she lacked was the courage to let herself know what she already knew. That was different. That required a different kind of intervention. I called her the next morning and asked her to have coffee with me on Saturday. She said yes. She sounded tired, but the tiredness had a different quality now. A readier quality, the tiredness of someone approaching something. I put my phone down and began quietly and methodically to prepare. Part 6, family. Our family is not a simple one. I want you to understand the landscape before I take you further into the story, because what happened next cannot be understood without it. Our parents, Greta and Dieter Voss, had been married for 34 years. They lived in Monschau, still in the house where Maren and I grew up. A wide stone house on the edge of the old town, with a garden that faced south and caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything look briefly golden. Our father was a retired engineer. Our mother taught piano at the local music school. They were by any measure a successful marriage. They had built something real and durable together, not without difficulty, not without years that were harder than others, but enduring. What Maren and I knew, and what our parents had never discussed openly with us, was that the first decade of their marriage had included a crisis of almost exactly the kind that Maren now faced. When I was 4 and Maren was 2, our father had had a brief 6-month affair with a colleague. Our mother had discovered it, not through anyone's confession, but through the same slow accumulation of evidence that characterizes any truth that is trying to surface. They had not divorced. They had done something harder. They had stayed and worked and rebuilt in a process that I am sure was painful in ways that were never described to us because parents do not describe those things to their children. I knew about the affair because I was an archivist and because the traces of it were still present in the texture of certain silences in our family, in the careful way my father occasionally looked at my mother when she was not looking at him, in the particular quality of gratitude that existed in him toward her. A gratitude that was too specific and too deep to have been generated by ordinary domestic partnership alone. Maren did not know, or she had not let herself know. She was only 2 when it happened, and the knowledge had never been made explicit, and she had grown up with a simpler picture of our parents than I had. I thought about this as I prepared for Saturday, about what our parents had done, about what they had built on the other side of the hardest years, about whether that was possible and under what conditions and what it cost. These thoughts were not sentimental. I am not a sentimental person, but I am a person who believes in evidence, and the evidence before me was a marriage of 34 years, built partly on the ruins of something that should have destroyed it, and the 2 daughters who were alive and formed and functional because that marriage had held. That was evidence worth considering. Part 7, Saturday, coffee. We met at a small cafe on the Aachener Strasse, the one with the dark wood tables and the window that faces the street. Maren arrived 5 minutes late, which was not like her. She was wearing a coat I had not seen before, a dark green wool coat, and she looked, I thought, like someone who had dressed carefully because they were bracing for something. I had ordered 2 flat whites. She sat down and wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at me for a moment before she said anything. She said, "I think something is happening with Felix that I cannot explain, and I do not know what to do." I said nothing. I let the words sit there. She told me what she had noticed. Not the things I knew. Her things. The small, intimate things that you only notice when you share a bed and a bathroom and a kitchen table with someone. The way he slept on the far edge of the bed, now which he had not done before. The way he laughed too quickly at jokes, the laugh slightly too loud. The laugh of someone managing an atmosphere rather than genuinely responding to it. The way he had 3 weeks ago looked at her across the dinner table with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to apology. As though he had already done something and was sorry about it, but had not yet decided to tell her. She said, "I feel like I am living with a version of him that is trying very hard to seem like the original." I sat very still. I thought she has already done everything she needs to do. She has seen all of it. She does not need me to give her information. She needs someone to confirm that her perception is not madness. I said, "I think you should trust what you are seeing." She looked at me. Her eyes were very clear and very tired. She said, "Do you know something?" I considered this for a long time. 5 seconds. 10. Then I said, "I do not have proof of anything specific, but I think you are not wrong." She set her cup down carefully. She did not cry. She sat with a straightness in her spine that reminded me painfully of something very old in our family. Of our grandmother standing at a window in Monschau. Of our mother on a difficult evening I had witnessed once when I was 9, standing in the kitchen with her back to the room and her shoulders perfectly level, absorbing something. She said, "What do I do?" And I said the only true thing I could say. I do not know. But you need to ask him. You need to put it directly in front of him and let him answer. Not because the answer will be comfortable, because you cannot make a decision in the dark. She nodded once, slowly. We sat together for another hour without talking about it again. We drank our coffee. We talked about her work, about a documentary she had watched about our mother's upcoming birthday, ordinary things. But there was something different between us, a new weight, that was also strangely a relief, the weight of a thing named. When she stood to put on her dark green coat, she stopped and looked at me for a moment. She said, "You are always so calm. How are you always so calm?" I did not know how to answer that in a way that would have made sense to her. So I said I learned it from you, which was a lie, but a kind one. She left. I sat alone at the dark wood table and finished my coffee and looked out at the Aachener Strasse and thought about ropes and pens and doors, about the farmer's hands, about what it means to hold the rope and choose not to pull. It was the first time in my life that I had chosen not to pull, and I sat with that choice for a long time, feeling its unfamiliar weight. Part 8, Confrontation. Myron confronted Felix 3 days later. She told me about it afterward in segments on different days, as she was ready to say each part. It was not a single conversation, but a series of them, erupting across 4 days like the aftershocks of an earthquake, each one quieter than the last, but each one going deeper. The first conversation was on the Tuesday evening. She asked him directly, not as an accusation, as a question, a genuine question, offered to him with a seriousness that he apparently was not prepared for. He denied it. Of course he denied it. He denied it with the particular fluency of someone who had prepared for this moment, who had rehearsed the denial because he had always known it might be necessary. But Maren had grown up in the same family I had grown up in. She was softer than me, more open, more inclined toward warmth and connection. But she was not foolish. She had been watching him for months, with the specific attention of a woman who knows her own home, and she had all the evidence that mattered, not the forensic kind, but the domestic kind. The kind that does not require proof because it is made of 1,000 small, undeceivable details. She told him what she had noticed, not what I had told her, which was almost nothing. Her own accumulated evidence. He could not deny all of it. Each detail she named took something away from his performance. By the end of the first conversation, the denial had become smaller and smaller, and finally it became, in the specific silence that followed her last observation, nothing at all. He told her the truth on the Thursday, 6 months. Sophie Bauer. It had begun in Vienna and had continued through the autumn. It was over, he said. It had been over for 3 weeks. He had ended it because he said he had realized what he was doing to their marriage, to himself, to the life they had built. He was not offering this as an excuse. He was offering it as information. Maren told me he had cried. Felix Marchetti, the man with the expensive shoes and the practiced attentiveness, had sat across from her at their kitchen table in the Lindenthal apartment and wept with the specific ugly quality of a person weeping for the first time in a very long time. She said it was not a beautiful kind of crying. It was the kind that looks like crumbling. She did not comfort him. She told him she needed time to think, and she asked him to go and stay with his brother in Dusseldorf for 2 weeks. He went. Part 9, The Weeks Without. Maren stayed in the apartment. I came every other day. I brought food which she sometimes ate and sometimes only looked at. I sat with her through the long evenings when she talked and talked and talked, unspoiling the whole of the last 3 years, with the urgent energy of someone trying to understand how it had all been assembled. I listened. I did not direct the conversation. I did not offer interpretations. I have always known that interpretation is a form of power, and in those evenings the power had to belong to her. There were the things she blamed herself for. There always are. She had been focused on her own career transition that year, a move from her position at a marketing agency. to a freelance consultancy she had been building slowly. She had been preoccupied. She had missed things. She had told herself the distance was stress, was normal, was temporary. I did not tell her that none of this was her fault. Not because it was not true, but because she needed to arrive at that understanding herself through the work of turning the evidence over in her own hands. If I gave her the conclusion, it would belong to me. If she found it herself, it would belong to her, and she could stand on it. One evening, she asked me something unexpected. She said, "Did you know before I did?" I sat with the question. I said I had suspicions, I did not have certainty. She said, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Because you already knew. You called me at 11 o'clock at night. You knew. What you needed was to trust yourself not to be given someone else's knowledge." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is that the truth, or is that something kind you are saying?" I said, "It is both. Sometimes they are the same." She laughed, a short, dry laugh, the first laugh I had heard from her in 2 weeks. I registered it. With the same attention, I register everything. A small, important data point. During those weeks, I also thought about Sophie Bauer. Not with hostility exactly, with the careful attention I give to anyone whose choices have consequences in a story I am adjacent to. She was by any measure responsible for a portion of what had happened. She had known Felix was married. She had made a choice. But she was also a person whose choices had been made in the complex, often self-deluding space of an intimate feeling. And I have never been able to entirely condemn the things people do when they are in the grip of what they believe to be love. Because I have never been in that grip myself, and I cannot be certain of what it does to a person's reasoning. What I thought about most in those 2 weeks was my parents. I drove down to Moncho one afternoon without calling ahead the way I used to when I was young and did not want to announce myself. I parked on the old cobblestone street and sat in the car for a while looking at the south-facing garden. The afternoon light was doing what it always does there, turning everything briefly golden. My father was in the garden with his gloves on, doing something slow and focused, with the rose bushes along the far wall. I watched him for a moment. 63 years old, careful, quiet, still working at the roses with the particular patience of a person who has learned the value of attention to things that grow slowly. I got out of the car and he looked up and saw me, and his face did the thing it has always done when he sees me, a specific, private pleasure. The pleasure of a person who has a particular understanding with one of his children. I walked through the gate and said hello, and he said hello, and we stood together in the golden light. And he did not ask me why I had come. He knew I would say whatever I had come to say when I was ready to say it. After a while, I said, "Do you think some things can be rebuilt once they have been broken?" He pulled a dead branch from the rose bush and turned it in his gloved hands. He said, "The rose does not know it has been cut. It only knows whether it has been tended." I stood there for a long time in the light. Then I said, "I think Maren is going to need you. And perhaps Mama too." He said, "We will be here." That was all, but it was enough. It was in fact everything. Part 10, My Mother Speaks. My mother came to Cologne the following weekend. She did not announce this. She simply appeared at Maren's door on Saturday morning with a bag of groceries and the specific, quietly formidable energy she has always deployed in situations of family crisis, an energy that does not ask what you need, but rather assesses the situation, with decades of practiced accuracy, and proceeds to provide it. She made lunch. She ran a bath for Maren. She changed the sheets in the bedroom. She rearranged 3 objects on the kitchen counter without being asked or commenting on having done it. These were not gestures of control. They were the gestures of a woman who expresses love through the practical reordering of spaces that have become disordered by grief. In the afternoon, when Maren was resting, my mother and I sat in the kitchen with cups of tea, and she was quiet in the way she is quiet when she is deciding whether to say something. Then she said it. She told me about the first years of her marriage to my father. She told me what had happened with the colleague. She did not name the colleague. She told me what it had been like to discover it, which she described not as a sudden shock, but as the arrival of a certainty she had been building for months and had been trying to argue herself out of. She told me what the 2 years afterward had been like. How much she had hated him, in the specific way you hate someone who has broken something irreplaceable. How much she had loved him, in the specific way you love someone who is irreplaceable even when they have broken something. How those two things had existed in her simultaneously for a long time without resolving. She said I stayed because I believed the person I married still existed somewhere inside the person who had done this, and because I decided to find out if that was true. Not because I forgave him, because I needed to know if the thing I had built with him was as real as I had believed it was. I said, was it? She said yes, but it was different after. Not worse, not exactly. Just with a knowledge in it that had not been there before. The knowledge that nothing is guaranteed. That you have to choose every day. She looked at me steadily for a moment. My mother has grey eyes, the same grey as the apartment walls I chose flat and honest. She said, I am not telling Maren this. Not yet. This is hers to find her own way through. But I am telling you because you are the one who will understand it. I said, why me? She said, because you see things other people do not see, and you carry things other people do not know they put down. And because I know you have been watching this for longer than Maren has. The kitchen was very quiet. I said I should have told her sooner. My mother said without hesitation, no, you should not have. You told her what she needed when she needed it. That is a very difficult thing to do, and most people do not have the discipline to do it. I looked at my tea. I am not, as I have said, a sentimental person, but there are moments when the body overrides the mind's preferences, and this was one of them. I felt something in my chest that I did not have language for. Not grief, not relief, something anterior to both. Something that had been waiting there for a long time. I did not cry. My mother took my hand across the table for a moment, and then released it, and refilled her own cup, and we did not speak of it again. Part 11, Felix returns. He returned after the agreed 2 weeks. Not to the apartment, not yet. They met at a restaurant on neutral ground, a small, unremarkable place on the Severinstrasse, that neither of them had a history with. I know this because Maren told me every detail afterward, sitting in my apartment with her hands in her lap, and her voice very even. He was different, not in a theatrical way, not performing contrition for an audience. She said he seemed smaller, not diminished in an ugly way, but reduced to a truer scale. The way objects look more themselves when you remove the staging from around them. He said he did not expect forgiveness. He said he had spent the 2 weeks in Dusseldorf, in his brother's spare room, doing what he had not permitted himself to do in months, which was to think about his own life with honest attention. He said he had understood things about himself that he had been avoiding for a long time. Not as explanations for what he had done. He was very specific about this. Not as explanations, as information about who he was and what work he had to do on himself, regardless of what Maren decided. He said, whatever you decide, I understand. If you cannot do this, I understand. But if there is any part of you that wants to try, I want you to know that I am prepared to do whatever that requires. Therapy, time, whatever it takes. Not because I think I deserve another chance, because I believe in what we had, and I will not insult it by pretending I do not. Maren told me she sat across from him for a long time after he finished speaking. She said the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a working silence. She was in that silence doing the kind of internal calculation that cannot be rushed. She said she told him she needed more time. He said he would wait. He went back to Dusseldorf. She said to me, telling me this, I do not know if I can forgive him. I do not even know if forgiveness is the right frame. I think it is more like... She paused. She said, I think it is more like deciding whether the thing between us is something I still want to be part of. Whether it belongs to me, or only to the version of me that existed before I knew this? I said, that is the right question. She said, do you think I should try? I did not answer for a moment. This was not a moment for the archivist. This was not a moment for the person who watches and gathers and calculates. This was a moment for the sister. I said, I think you already know what you want to do, and I think you are waiting until you trust yourself enough to do it. She was quiet. She said, I think I am afraid that if I try and it fails, I will have wasted the time between now and then. I said, you will not have wasted it. You will have learned what you needed to learn. To know it could not hold. That is not nothing. That is a great deal. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, when did you become wise? I said, I have always been watching. I just started saying things out loud. Part 12, Sophie Bauer. I want to tell you what I did not do. I did not go to Sophie Bauer's office and stand in front of her desk and lay out for her in the careful and complete way that I am capable of precisely what she had done and what it had cost. I thought about it. I will not pretend I did not think about it. I am very good at thinking about things I do not do. But Sophie Bauer was not the center of this story. She was an element of it, an important element, one with her own interior life and her own reasons and her own accumulation of choices that had led her to this particular consequence. But she was not the person I loved. She was not my sister. She was not my father standing in a garden with rose pruning gloves. She was not the center. And I had spent too much of my life in the periphery, organizing information that other people considered unimportant, to use my particular skills in the service of something small. What I did instead was this. I sent Sophie Bauer a letter, not an angry letter, not a threatening one. One paragraph. I told her plainly, and without embellishment, that I was Maren's sister, that I was aware of the situation, that I had chosen not to intervene in it in any way that would make it worse than it already was, that I was writing to her, not to accuse her, or to demand anything from her, but to tell her, from the position of someone who watches carefully, that the life she had been part of for the last 6 months had belonged to someone else, that I hoped she would going forward make choices that belonged to her own life and not to someone else's. I signed it with my full name. I did not know whether it would matter to her. I did not know whether she was the kind of person who responds to that kind of address. But I had learned from years of watching that there is a specific type of truth that only lands when it comes from an unexpected direction, from someone who has no obvious motive to deliver it. I was the unexpected direction. I mailed it and let it go. I did not need to know how she received it. That was not my information to hold. Part 13, The Return. Felix came back to the apartment 6 weeks after the confrontation. Not dramatically, not with declarations. He came back with a bag and his careful, quiet presence and the specific humility of a person who knows that they are in a space on probation and has decided to be worthy of the trust that implies. Maren had made the decision, not because the wound was healed, it was not. Not because she had forgiven him. She had not yet, not entirely, but because she had done the calculation that my mother had done 30 years earlier in a kitchen in Monschau, the calculation that looks at a person and asks, does this person still exist, the person I chose? And the answer had been yes. Changed and reduced to truer scale and carrying a knowledge now that was not gentle but yes. I was not there when he came back. That was correct. That moment belonged to them. She called me that evening after he had arrived, after the first careful and unprecedented hours of coexistence in a space that was both the same apartment and an entirely different one. She did not say much. She said, "He is here." I said, "How does it feel?" She said, "Like standing in a place after a flood. Everything is still here, but everything is different." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For everything you did not do." I sat with that for a long time after I put the phone down. For everything you did not do. Touch. Part 14. What I learned. I want to try to tell you what this year did to me. I am not skilled at this kind of accounting. I am more comfortable with the outward-facing accounting, the observation of others, the gathering of information about the world outside myself. But I am attempting to be honest with you, as I have been attempting to be honest from the beginning. I learned something about the difference between power and love. I had always known what power was. I knew its anatomy very precisely. The information advantage, the capacity to act when others cannot, the patience to wait until the exactly correct moment. I had spent my entire life, since that October morning, in the Monschau livestock market building, something that I understood as a capability. The capability to see clearly, to move without being seen, to shape outcomes from the edges. I was proud of this capability in a way I had never examined very closely. It was mine. It was the private architecture of my interior life. But watching Maren in those months, watching the specific and unglamorous work of a person trying to survive a betrayal and decide what they want on the other side of it, I encountered something I had not previously encountered in myself. Fear, not the ordinary fear, not the social fear, the fear of exposure or consequence, something deeper. The fear of a person who has spent their life organizing information but has never permitted herself to be disorganized by another person. The fear of the uninventoried, of the thing you cannot archive, because it is happening inside you and therefore has no legible shape. I was afraid that what Maren was doing, the risk of it, the choosing to return to a thing that had hurt her, was something I would never be capable of. That my particular kind of intelligence, precise and collecting and armored, was incompatible with that kind of risk. I am still not certain I was wrong about that. I am 31 years old, and I live alone in a north-facing apartment, and I have never permitted anyone inside the interior that matters. The private architecture remains private, but I think that this year changed something about how I carry it. I think that watching my sister choose the risk, and watching my mother tell her story at a kitchen table, and watching my father stand in the golden light with his gloved hands and his 34 years of a marriage that had passed through something terrible and come out the other side as something truer. I think that watching all of this did something to the shape of my interior. I do not know what to call what it did. I am not sure I have the language for it. I am an archivist. I work with information that other people have already gathered. I do not have a category for this particular kind of data, but I have filed it. I have given it its own shelf. And occasionally when I am sitting in my north-facing apartment with my cold tea and my long silence, I take it down and look at it. Part 15, a year later. 1 year after the Saturday coffee on the Aachener Strasse, I drove down to Monschau for my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. My father had made reservations at the restaurant in the old mill outside town, the one with the stone walls and the candles and the menu that does not change. We were 5, my parents, Maren and Felix and me. It was December. The town was lit with the small lights that they string along the narrow streets every winter, and the air smelled of cold stone and pine and the particular thin sweetness of Christmas markets. We walked from the parking area to the restaurant, along the cobblestone street, and I walked slightly behind the others, the way I always do, observing. My parents walked ahead, my father with his hand at the small of my mother's back. Not a performative gesture. The absent habitual gesture of a man who has been doing this for 35 years and whose body has decided it is the correct position. My mother's shoulders were straight under her coat. She was saying something to him in the low voice she uses when she is not speaking for an audience. Maren and Felix walked behind them. They were not touching, but the distance between them had changed since the year before. It had closed, not entirely, perhaps not entirely ever again, but it had closed in the specific way that distance closes when two people have decided to be in the same direction. Maren was talking about something, and he was listening in the way he listens now, which is different from the way he used to listen, more true, more actually present, less performed. I walked behind them all and watched. The restaurant was warm, the food was good. My mother told a story about a student who had come to her for a piano lesson that week and had unusual talent, but played with his eyes shut and kept insisting that counting was for people who did not feel the music. And my father laughed, in the way he laughs at her stories completely, without reservation. Felix refilled my mother's wine glass before she asked, which she accepted, with a thanks that was genuine and exactly calibrated, the thanks of a woman who has decided to extend something and means it. Marin watched him do this and looked at the table and then looked up at me. Across the table, and something passed between us that was too complex to name. At some point in the evening, while the others were talking, my father leaned over to me and said quietly, "You look different." I said, "Different how?" He said, "Like you put something down that you had been carrying for a long time." I considered this. I said, "Maybe I did." He said, "Good." And that was all. We ate dessert, and my mother proposed a toast to 35 years, and we drank the toast, and then we walked back through the small streets with the lights, and the air was cold and clear. And somewhere ahead of me, Marin laughed at something Felix said, a real laugh, unguarded and brief and real. I walked behind them all, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel the need to watch. Epilogue: What Remains. I am 31 years old, and I live in a north-facing apartment in Cologne, and I work as a data archivist at an insurance company called Bernhardt und Wolff. I am quiet and watchful, and I wear grey most days. These things have not changed, but other things have. I took down the partition in my mind between the information I gather about the world and the information I carry about myself. Not completely. I am not sure I am capable of completely, but I have let them be adjacent to one another in a way they were not before, and the adjacency changes things. It makes the gathering of outward information feel less like armor and more like what I think it actually is, a form of care, a way of paying attention to the people around me that, if used correctly, can protect them rather than simply describe them. My sister's marriage is not the same as it was before. It is, I think, better, but better in the specific way that things which have been repaired are better than they were, not stronger, exactly, but more honest, more aware of their own vulnerability. They attend couples therapy on Tuesday evenings. Felix has taken up painting badly in a room he has repurposed from a home office. And Marin has begun to sleep again with the uncomplicated depth that she had when she was young and did not know yet that sleep could become something difficult. My parents came to visit me in Cologne in the spring. My mother played my small second-hand piano for an hour, while my father and I sat in the living room and listened. Afterward, my father looked around my apartment, at the north-facing windows and the clean surfaces, and the careful organization of everything, and he said, "You have made a very honest space." I thought about that for days afterward. A very honest space. That is not nothing. That is, I think, what I have been building all along without knowing it. Not an arsenal, not an archive, a space where things can be seen clearly, including myself. Sophie Bauer left Gruner on Machete in the spring. I know this because I still look occasionally, because old habits do not dissolve entirely. She took a position at a smaller firm in Hamburg. I do not know if she received my letter or what she made of it. I have let that go. It is no longer my information to hold. I went back to Monschau in August. Not for any occasion, just to drive down and sit in the south-facing garden with my father while he tended the roses. I did not say anything important. He did not say anything important. We sat in the afternoon light, which was doing its usual thing, and the garden smelled of earth and green things and the faint sweetness of the roses along the far wall. After a while, I said, "The roses are coming back well." He said, "They always do, if you give them what they need." I looked at the roses for a long time. I thought about everything I had gathered, and everything I had chosen not to use, and everything that had happened anyway, and everything that had been built on the other side of the worst of it. I thought about Marin laughing in the street in Monschau in December, real and unguarded and brief. I thought about my mother's hand covering mine at the kitchen table and then releasing it. I thought about what I am and what I am for, and what I have always misunderstood about the difference between watching and caring. I have always been the person who watches, but watching, I understand now, is not a substitute for being present. It is, if you do it correctly, the beginning of it. Additional chapter, The Architecture of Grief. What I have not yet told you because I did not know how to tell it in sequence without interrupting. The flow of the primary story is what was happening in my own life during those months. I have been narrating Marin's crisis as though I were purely its witness. And that is partly true, but it is not entirely true. And I made a promise at the beginning of this account to be honest with you. And so I will be honest with you now. I have been in love once. I say once with precision. Not because I am certain I will not be in love again, though. At 31, I remain genuinely uncertain about my own capacity for it, but because I am certain that what happened to me when I was 24 was singular in my experience. I have not had anything comparable before or since. His name was Luca Ferreira. Portuguese by background, raised in Lisbon and then Amsterdam, living in Cologne, on a research contract with the university when I met him. 28 years old to my 24, he studied computational linguistics, which means he spent his days thinking about the relationship between language and meaning, about the gap between what is said and what is communicated, which was, I recognized immediately, a discipline organized around the same interest I had organized my entire life around. We met at a lecture on information theory at the university. I had attended not because I was enrolled in anything, but because I was and have always been a person who goes to lectures on information theory at universities when they are not enrolled in anything. I sat at the end of a row near the back. He sat 2 seats away. Halfway through the lecture, he leaned slightly in my direction and said, very quietly, that the speaker had just made an error in his framing of Shannon's redundancy theorem, and did I notice that? I said I noticed it in the 3rd sentence of that section. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on a person's face before when they were looking at me. We talked for 4 hours after the lecture. We talked in the corridor, then in the university cafe, then walking along the river as it got dark and then darker. He talked about language the way I think about patterns, as systems with interior logics that could be decoded if you were willing to pay enough attention and accept that the logic was always more complex than your first interpretation of it. I talked about information in the way I think about it as a substance, with its own weight and its own behavior accumulating in ways that are not always visible until they have already become structural. He said at one point, "You think about everything as though you are trying to understand how it is built." I said, "Is that not how everyone thinks?" He said, "No. Most people think about things in terms of what they mean. You think about things in terms of how they work." I considered this. I said, "Is that a criticism?" He said, "No, I find it extraordinary." That was the beginning of it. What followed was 10 months in which I permitted, for the first and only time in my life, another person inside the private architecture of my interior. Not entirely inside it. I am not certain I am capable of entirely. But inside enough that his presence there changed the dimensions of everything. The north-facing apartment felt different when he was in it. The flat, honest light did something different in his company. It became interesting rather than simply accurate. I noticed things about the world around me that I had not noticed before, not because my attention had diminished, but because it had, for the first time, a specific person to bring things back to. This is love, I understand now. It is not a condition. It is a direction. It is what happens when your habitual act of gathering suddenly has a recipient. He left Cologne when his research contract ended. I knew it was coming. I had known it was coming since the 3rd week, which is when I calculated the endpoint of his contract and understood the structure of what we were doing. I did not tell him I knew. I let it arrive without announcement. When he left, he asked me to come with him. He was moving to Brussels for a position at a research institute there. He asked me carefully, in the way he did everything, not as a demand or even an expectation, but as a genuine offer held out in the specific way you hold something out to someone you are not certain will take it. I said no. I have thought about this more times than I can count in the years since. I have turned it over, the way I turn over every pattern looking for the logic of it. I said no because I was afraid. Not of Brussels, not of the practical disruption of the move, not of the logistics. I was afraid of the complete version of it, of being entirely inside someone else's life, where the information flow is bidirectional and uncontrolled, and you cannot choose what to observe and what to file away. I was afraid of being known in the specific way that requires you to know yourself first, and I was 24 and did not know myself in that way yet. I said no, and he left, and the north-facing apartment became purely north-facing again, honest and flat and without direction. I have not been in love since. I have not permitted the conditions for it since. Whether this is a loss or a preservation is a question I have not yet resolved. But I tell you this now because it is relevant to what came after, to the year of watching Maren move through her crisis and come out the other side still standing. Because Maren's story, which I have been telling you, as though I were a clear and unaffiliated narrator, was also a mirror. Every time I watched her sit in her grief and her calculation, every time I watched her decide not to run from the complexity of a feeling that had broken her open, I was watching myself from the outside. Watching what I had not been willing to do. Watching with the specific and unglamorous attention of a person who has spent their life watching what it looks like to choose to remain inside something difficult. I filed this observation, I gave it its own shelf, and at some point during that year, I found the shelf again and took it down and looked at it for a very long time. The additional chapter, The Things Felix Did Not Say. There is a conversation I should tell you about that I have been omitting. Not deliberately or not entirely deliberately, but because it belongs to a part of the story that I was uncertain how to narrate without making myself more central to it than I ought to be. Felix came to see me, not during the crisis, not while he was in Dusseldorf. Afterward, about 3 months into the careful and ongoing process of reconstruction that Maren and Felix had undertaken. He came to my apartment on a Tuesday evening in February. He had texted an hour earlier to ask if he could come. I said yes. He brought wine, which was the gesture of a man who is not sure of his welcome, but wishes to indicate good faith through concrete action. I poured 2 glasses, and we sat in the living room, which has no comfortable arrangement for 2 people who have something difficult to say to one another. There is a sofa and a chair, and they face slightly away from each other, which I have always preferred for reading, but which creates an uncomfortable angle for conversation. We sat with this angle and did not address it. He said, I know you knew before Maren did. I said nothing. He said, I am not asking how or what. I am not asking you to tell me anything. I just want to say that I know, and I want to tell you that I think you made a choice that was in every way that matters the right one. I looked at my wine. I said, I made the choice that seemed to have the best outcome for my sister. He said, I know. That is what I mean. There was a silence. He turned his glass in his hands. Felix Marchetti, who had always been careful and managed and equipped with a surface that resisted close examination, now appeared without that surface, or with a different kind of surface, thinner, more permeable. The surface of someone who has been through a process that has removed several layers of insulation. He said, Can I ask you something? I said, You can ask. He said, Did you ever consider making it worse for me than it ended up being? I sat with this for a moment. It was a direct question. He deserved a direct answer. I said, Yes. He said, What stopped you? I said, The fact that what would have been worse for you would have also been worse for Maren. And she was what mattered. He nodded. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I am going to spend the rest of my life being worthy of what she chose to do. I am aware that this is not enough, but I want you to know that I understand what she gave up, the easy option to give me, and I understand what that costs, and I will not forget it. I looked at him. I said, I know you mean that. He said, I said, but meaning it and doing it are different projects. And the second one is longer and harder. And I will be watching. He looked at me for a moment. Then he did something I did not expect. He smiled. Not the practiced social smile. The genuine, rueful, unguarded smile of someone who has just been told a truth they needed to hear. He said, I know you will. Honestly, that is more reassuring than you might think. We finished the wine. He left. The apartment was north-facing and quiet and flat and honest again, but something had shifted. The information I held about Felix Marchetti had reorganized itself. He was no longer a pattern I was tracking from the outside. He was a person I had sat with in a room and exchanged a real conversation, with a conversation in which neither of us had managed anything. It was an unusual experience for me. I did not dislike it. Additional, chapter the piano in the hallway. My mother taught me to play the piano when I was 6 years old. I was not a natural student. I had the patience for it, but not the ease, not the physical ease that certain children have with instruments. The way their bodies seem to already know the thing they are being taught. I had to learn everything, consciously, every fingering, every dynamic, every phrase of music broken into its components and then reassembled. My mother, who was a natural musician, found this fascinating in me. She told me once that watching me learn to play was like watching someone learn to walk, who had decided first to understand the biomechanics of walking. She said it produced eventually a very different kind of walking than the ordinary sort, more deliberate, more certain, less graceful, but more honest. I played until I was 14, and then I stopped, not for any dramatic reason, but because the investment of time required to make the kind of progress I wanted did not seem justifiable against the other claims on my attention. I stored the technique away the way I stored everything and turned to other things. After the winter anniversary dinner in Monchaux, after the drive back to Cologne, I found myself sitting in front of the second-hand piano my mother had helped me acquire some years before, for reasons I had never entirely examined. I sat down in front of it, without having intended to, and placed my hands on the keys. The technique was still there, reduced, diminished, missing the suppleness that comes from regular use but structurally present. The hands remembered what the mind had stored. I played a simple piece I had learned as a child, a short Schumann study, and the notes came out unevenly, with gaps where the fluency had eroded, but structurally intact. I played it several times. It did not improve dramatically, but something about the playing was different from what I remembered, different from the deliberate biomechanical quality my mother had described. It was not graceful. It was still not graceful, but it had something I had not expected. It had, I thought, the specific quality of something done without an audience, without the management of impression, without the calculation of effect. I played in the north-facing apartment for an hour alone, badly, and then I put my hands in my lap and looked at the wall. I was thinking about Luca Ferreira. I was thinking about Brussels. I was thinking about the specific shape of the choice I had made when I was 24, and about whether the shape of that choice had changed in the 7 years since. I am not going to tell you that I called him. I am not going to give you that resolution. This is not that kind of story. What I am going to tell you is that I thought about it. That for the first time in 7 years, I thought about it as something that had not yet fully closed, rather than as a door I had shut. That is a small thing. But I am an archivist. I understand the importance of small things. I filed the thought. I gave it its own shelf. And I left it there accessible for the first time, not locked.
Sure.
Additional chapter, what Maren knows about me. I said earlier that Maren does not know about the version of me that I have been describing in this account. The watching, the gathering, the private architecture of capability that I have been building since I was 9 years old in the Monchaux livestock market I said, she has a simpler picture of me than is accurate. This is true, but it is not the whole truth. Maren does not know the specific contents of what I carry. She does not know about the 127 mental models I built during my adolescence, which I have long since filed away without acting on residue of a mind that was trying to understand power and could only think about it in terms of control. She does not know about the hotel on the Konrad Adenauer Ufer or what I saw there, or the careful months of observation that preceded it. She does not know about the letter to Sophie Bauer, but she knows something. She has always known something, not in a way she could articulate, not in a way she has ever tried to name. But she knows me with the specific knowledge that sisters carry of each other, the knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, that has been built from 29 years of being in the same rooms and the same grief and the same light. She knows that I am not simply quiet. She knows that my quiet is a particular kind of quiet. She knows that when I am very still, I am not resting. She said something to me once, years before any of this happened. We were 20 and 22 and sharing a flat for a summer, while I did a temporary archive contract and she was doing an internship. We had gone to a party that neither of us particularly wanted to attend, and on the walk home afterward, she said completely out of context, as though she had been thinking about it all evening, "Sometimes I think you know everything that is going to happen before it happens." I said, "That is not true." She said, "I know it is not literally true. I mean something different. I mean, it is like you have already thought through every version of every situation, and you are just waiting to see which one arrives." I walked for a moment without answering. Then I said, "Is that frightening?" She considered it for longer than I expected. Then she said, "No. It is actually the most reassuring thing I know. I think about that often. The most reassuring thing I know. I have turned it over many times in the years since, trying to understand it." She did not mean that she was reassured by the idea of being watched. She meant something more specific than that. She meant that there is a particular kind of safety in being known by someone who does not look away. Most people, when they love someone, look at that person with a kind of deliberate blur. They soften the focus. They see the version they prefer, the version that is easiest to love. I have never been capable of that deliberate blur. I see the people I love with the same complete, undeflecting attention I give to everything. I see their weaknesses and their errors, and their vanities, and their specific personal ugliness and their beauty in the same field of vision without hierarchy. Maren knows this about me. She cannot articulate it, but she has always known it, and she has always found it despite its demands, despite its unwillingness to soften a kind of gift. That is, I think, the thing I have most difficulty understanding about myself. That what I thought of as a system, a technique, a capability, might be from the outside simply a form of love, the most honest form I am capable of. I have been thinking about that for a long time. I do not yet know what to do with it, but I have given it its own shelf. The additional chapter, the city and its patterns. I live in Cologne, and Cologne is a city I have organized over the years into a precise interior map. Not the official map, not the tourist map with its cathedral and its Roman Germanic museum and its 11 churches. My map. The map of patterns and rhythms that I have been building through attention for the 11 years I have lived here. I know the rhythm of the Neumarkt at every hour of the day and each season. I know which stalls at the Wochenmarkt on Saturdays are managed by vendors who have been there for decades and which are operated by newer arrivals, and what the difference is in the quality of attention they bring to their produce and their customers. I know which side streets in the Belgisches Viertel are used by delivery drivers as cut-throughs and which are purely residential, quiet enough that unusual footsteps are heard. I know the hour at which the light on the Rhine changes from silver to gold in summer and how this varies across the months. I know the faces of the night security staff at my office building and the precise timeline of their patrol routes. Not because I have any use for this information, but because I cannot help gathering it. This map is not useful in the way I once believed it would be useful. When I was younger, when I was building the 127 models in my adolescent mind, I believed that this kind of knowledge was accumulating towards something, a capacity for action, a potential for control. I understood the world as a system, and I believed, learning its controls. I understand now that this was a young person's way of managing fear. The fear of the uncontrollable. The fear of what happens when you love someone and cannot protect them. The fear, perhaps most fundamentally, of being a person who watches things happen rather than a person who makes things happen. The 127 models were never about crime. They were about control. They were a child's answer to the terror of powerlessness. I am not condemning myself for them. A child finds the instruments available to her and uses them to build herself a structure she can stand in. That is what I did. The structure was cold and efficient and held me for many years, and in the end, it was not the right structure, but it held. Cologne is still a map to me. I still walk through it knowing where the camera blind spots are, knowing which streets have the least surveillance, knowing the rhythms that would allow a person to be unobserved. This knowledge does not go away. You cannot uneducate yourself from patterns you have absorbed. But the knowledge sits differently now. It is less like a weapon waiting to be used and more like a language. A language you learned young, before you knew what languages were for, and which turns out to be more useful for understanding than for speaking. I walk through Cologne and I read it. And what I read now is not the architecture of control, but the architecture of life. The specific and enormous complexity of 800,000 people living their days in proximity to one another, managing their fears and their desires and their secrets, and their love, building their private interiors, holding their ropes. I am one of them. I am not above the map. I am on it. This took me 31 years to understand. Sir, the additional chapter, the letter I did not send. In the spring following the winter anniversary, after the careful reconstruction was well underway, and the worst of the crisis had been absorbed, I wrote a letter, not to Sophie Bauer, not to Felix, to Luca Ferreira. I wrote it over the course of 3 evenings in my north-facing apartment, at the desk where the flat, honest light falls across the surface, without flattering anything. I wrote it by hand, which I have not done for correspondence in years, because I wanted the act of writing to require something physical, something that could not be deleted or revised without visible evidence of the revision. The letter was long, 7 pages. I told him what had happened in the years since he left, not in any spirit of accusation or grievance, but in the spirit of the archivist, which is the spirit of someone who believes that information shared becomes more accurate, that the act of transmitting something to a recipient changes the thing itself. I told him about Marin and Felix and the long watching year. I told him about Monschau and the roses. I told him about sitting in my apartment after the anniversary dinner and playing Schumann badly. I told him about what I had learned about the difference between watching and caring. I told him that I had thought about his offer, the one he had made at 28, standing in the Cologne Hauptbahnhof with his bags, with the quiet, genuine quality of a person who means what they say. I told him that I had thought about it many times in the 7 years since, always with the same conclusion, the same no. The same understanding that I had made the correct decision for the person I was at the time. And I told him that I was no longer certain I was that person. I finished the letter. I folded it into an envelope. I addressed the envelope, which was the most difficult part because it required me to know where he was, which required me to look, which required me to admit to myself that I had been keeping track of where he was in the quiet, absent way that I keep track of everything I have not been able to entirely file. He was still in Brussels, a professor now. The same research institute promoted from researcher to professor in the 6 years he had been there. I held the envelope for a long time. Then I put it in the desk drawer and went to bed. I did not send it. This is not a story about sending the letter. This is a story about writing it, about the distance between keeping something locked and keeping it accessible, about a shelf that had, for the first time, been taken down and looked at and returned to its place, not locked, but simply resting there available. Whether I will ever send it, I genuinely do not know, but I wrote it, by hand, 7 pages, in the flat, honest light. That is not nothing. The additional chapter, the thing about sisters. I want to tell you about the last time I saw Marin, before I sat down to write this account. It was 3 weeks ago, a Sunday in late September. The kind of autumn day in Cologne that is specific to the Rhine Valley, with a low pewter sky and the smell of wet leaves and the river moving slow and grey under the bridges. She had called and asked if I wanted to walk, just walk, no destination. I said yes. We walked along the Rheinufer for 2 hours. We talked about many things, some important and some not. She told me about a project she was excited about, a client she had taken on who wanted to launch an ethical fashion consultancy and needed someone with the specific combination of marketing experience and genuine values that Marin has. Her face when she talked about it had a particular animation, a forward-leaning enthusiasm that I recognized as the face she makes when she is working on something that belongs entirely to her. I was glad to see it. She asked me about work. I told her about a complex file reorganization project I had been tasked with. The company was merging 2 large legacy archives from an acquisition, and the information had been stored according to 2 entirely different organizing logics that were not compatible and had to be translated into a third logic that could hold both. She listened with the polite but not entirely absorbed attention of a person who is making the effort of interest for someone they love. She said, "Does it not depress you, working with other people's information all day?" I said, "No, I like it. I like the work of finding the system that can hold the whole thing." She looked at me sideways for a moment with the specific look of a person who is seeing something more clearly than usual. She said, "I think that is what you do with people too. You find the system that can hold them." I thought about this for a while as we walked. I said, "Maybe. I think I used to do that to understand them. Now I think I do it because I want to keep them." She stopped walking. She looked at me. Her face turned slightly toward the pewter sky, and the grey river had the expression I have known for 29 years. The expression that means she has heard something she was not expecting from me. She said, "Say that again." I said, "I want to keep people now. That is different from before." She stood still for a moment. The river moved under the bridge. A cyclist passed us. Then she took my arm and we kept walking. She did not say anything else about it for a while. We walked for another half hour in the particular comfortable silence that has always been the deepest register of our communication, the silence that does not need filling, that is itself a form of holding. Then she said, "I am glad you are still here." I know that sounds simple, but I mean it in the large way. I said, "I know you do." She said, "I mean that you are the most constant thing I have. You have always been the most constant thing I have." I walked beside her. The river was very grey and very real beside us. I said, "The feeling is mutual." She tightened her grip on my arm for a moment and then released it. We walked back to the tram stop. We said goodbye on the pavement, in the way we always say goodbye, with a brief, practical embrace. Not long, not theatrical, but complete. The embrace of people who know they will see each other again soon, and whose affection does not require demonstration. She went one direction, I went the other. I walked home along the Rheinufer as the pewter sky darkened and the streetlights came on. The city was doing what it always does in the evening, settling into its nighttime rhythm, the cafes filling the cyclists, heading home, the river running indifferently dark. I walked inside it and I thought about nothing in particular. I watched the lights on the water. I breathed the cold river air. I was for a specific and unusual length of time not gathering, not watching, not filing. Simply present in the evening of a city I have spent 11 years learning to read. Walking home to an apartment that faces north, That was 3 weeks ago. It was the beginning of this account. I am an archivist. I record things. I have been recording this because I believe that the thing I went through this year, the year of watching Marin and learning from what I watched, deserves to be recorded. Not because it is extraordinary, because it is not. Because it is the specific and ordinary learning that happens when a person who has been watching for a very long time finally turns the watching inward and survives the experience. I have told you everything I know how to tell. The rest is still filing itself. I am Alara Voss. I am 31 years old. I live in a north-facing apartment in Cologne. I wear grey most days. I am quiet and watchful, and I have inside me a private architecture that I have been building since I was 9 years old. It is not an arsenal anymore. I am still deciding what it is, but for the first time I am deciding with the windows open. End, sir. The silence between us is an original dramatic narrative set in Cologne and the Eifel region of Germany. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is entirely coincidental.